This is The Trend, where you'll get enlightened perspective on trending news and topics with amazing commentary. I'm your host, RTL Faith. Welcome to the podcast, and as always, we breathe the message here that we are here to spread discussion, debate, solution, and overall compassion. Welcome back, everybody. This is the Trend Podcast, of course, and I do apologize. Sunday, I was not able to upload. I had some issues in terms of mailing, and I wasn't able to get my proper equipment. So we'll get everything on track next Sunday. Don't worry about that. Today, we got an excellent episode, and we'll be answering the question on how we can evolve in the future of capitalism. Some people may hate that topic. Some people may love it. We'll dive into it. We have an expert to kind of dive into that type of information. And that guy here is my guy here, Noah. So go ahead, introduce yourself.
Thanks for having me here, RTL. So, as you said, my name's Noah Healy. I'm a recreational mathematician. I'm interested in computational mathematics, which basically boils down to learning about algorithms and analyzing algorithms for various factors that can be involved, both the efficiency of operation, stability under noise constraints, complexity of implementation, and so on. And I discovered a better kind of marketplace. Working on getting it patented. The patent office are being kind of buttheads about it, and I'm trying to get people to learn about this thing and try it out, and just turn the entire planet richer as a result.
Get some pins.
No shit, that's interesting.
Hey, that definitely seems like something that everybody would want to listen into. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance with starting something potentially game-breaking and a lot of potential barriers as well. So we'll discuss that, of course, and see what people can learn about what you got going on, of course. Now, as always, you guys know I like to read off a comment or review based on some of the content that I put out there, just so I'm, listening in on what people are saying. So this recent comment is regarding one of the clips we did about why people are drawn to some of the more inappropriate aspects of hip-hop music, guns, drugs, and sex. He said, Andrew Tate encourages men mentally, physically, and socially to become the best they can be. His personality is a little downside, but he is okay, but get banned on the internet. Blueface I F with, 1,000 females, beat up a white guy, Cardi B, drugs, men. Very fair. Saying Andrew Tate's a role model, and then we got all these other guys doing some really shady stuff. Have you heard? Do you know who Andrew Tate is?
No, I don't.
Okay, fair enough. Let's just say he's a very controversial figure, based on like what he preaches. He's very controversial to a certain side of like the ideological spectrum, and he ended up getting banned from all social media platforms. But he's still very popular. So, some people love him, some people hate him. It is what it is.
Well, controversy really sells in social media.
Very true, but it depends on the certain type of controversy which social media will allow or disallow. We'll talk about that a little bit more because there's some recent trending news about social media and the future of like how a lot of these states are going to be handling or dealing with social media and their stances. So we'll dive into that in a second. But to kind of introduce a question that I want you to answer later on, just like every guest I ask them, I want you to think about a situation, a debate, discussion, conversation you had with someone. And this person that you had with it this person probably think of someone who vehemently disagreed with everything you said and maybe potentially got heated, and think about that situation. We'll talk about it later, how you handle it, what the topic was about, and then see, how it kind of resolved and kind of look back on it. I think one of the aspects of this podcast that I kind of preach is the importance of conversation and discussion and debate, and how it is necessary to find ultimate solutions for all these things going on in terms of issues, and why conversations getting dwindled and limited nowadays. And this podcast is trying to emphasize why it's still necessary, it's still important. So you think about that, we'll revisit that at the end. So with that said, we're going to start our first segment: overrated, underrated, just right, OMU. And I'm going to fire off 10 topics. These 10 topics, spitfire. You're going to say overrated, underrated, just right. At the end, you can fill in whether you want to explain any of them if you want. And then you can just kind of go off. So, are you ready?
Sure.
First one. And these are random, by the way. First one, pharmacies.
Pharmacies. I'll go with just right.
Turtles.
Turtles. I'll go with overrated.
Interesting. Criminal justice system.
Criminal justice system. I'll go with underrated.
Okay. Toads.
Toads. Toads are underrated.
Monkeys.
Monkeys are overrated.
Capitalism.
Capitalism is overrated.
Becoming an entrepreneur.
Becoming an entrepreneur is definitely overrated.
Agriculture.
Agriculture is underrated.
AI technology.
AI technology, that is so weird these days.
Very true.
I'd say it's currently overrated.
Fears of AI sentience.
Those are underrated.
Okay, fair enough. Any of these you want to explain in a little bit more depth?
Well, capitalism's overrated for sort of the same reason that AI is overrated, and fears of AI are underrated. Um, but it's overrated in a totally different way. Capitalism has turned itself into a religion, literally. The doyens of Wall Street describe themselves as performing God's work. That's a direct quote. That's just insane. Um, it's a mechanism to gather and disseminate information, and as a consequence of that, it really is just another kind of communication computer system. Uh, and it's an incredibly expensive one that we're spending an enormous fraction of our time and energy on. At the same time, we've actually learned an enormous amount about computer and communication systems, which would allow us to spend significantly less on that and then reuse those resources in other places. Uh, but that's not even that. I mean, that's my gig. That's my expertise. But that's the small ball, because the big ball is that computers are based on a mathematical formalism that we're trying to solve a problem that everyone in the world was wrong about. So the very existence of computers essentially disproves one of the fundamental assumptions that goes into how we have built society. Uh, Going all the way back to the Enlightenment, the societies that look like the societies we have today, with free markets, representative governments, all that stuff was based on this notion that we could effectively found our countries on reason and logic instead of God. And we'd be able to get away with this because reason and logic were comprehensive and basically also infinitely powerful. Um, and what computers demonstrate is that that actually isn't true. That that the problem that was trying to be solved was that integer arithmetic. It was believed that there would be ways to always solve every integer arithmetic problem, and that's the math we teach, grade school kids. Um, it turns out that integer arithmetic is actually more complicated and interesting than sort of real number arithmetic, and it's actually impossible to solve every single one of those problems in a consistent manner. There are questions that require higher orders of thought. For any higher order of thought, you can find a question that requires a higher order than that. Eventually, you run out of capacity for that kind of intelligence. You can't solve the problem anymore. So that's going at the very pillars of our foundation of what what we actually believe about how societies can work. And so we have to rebuild, and we have to rebuild from the foundations upwards. And things like capitalism, uh, which are some of the really big, rocks that we're resting on, are some of the things that we actually have to build new versions of. And things like AI, which people see as sort of the vanguard of computer technology, are getting to be pretty cool toys these days. Uh, but it's really just the existence of computers at all and the consequences of understanding how they work and what they do that causes these philosophical problems with our culture, with our laws, and everything else.
Okay. I definitely want to dive into that a little bit deeper later on when we get in the main segment, because I do think that's a strong discussion point that we can dive into. Um, but before we even dive into that, we're going to go over our trending topics, because I know for a fact that conversation topic will be very expansive. Now, one thing I will say in regards to what you just said is I have had thoughts here and there in terms of, like, for me personally, I'm gonna make this personal so it's something relatable to the people listening. For me personally, I would consider myself more leaning towards like a logical side rather than an emotional side. I've been called logic to a fault. Like, I've been said I'll call that in a lot of different scenarios. But I do think that the value of being completely illogical, even if you want to be right in a debate, for example, is definitely overvalued, and that there's certain essences of like emotion, and I'm sure in like other ideologies you can tax upon that really makes you a proper person. So I do agree that in this essence of like what you're saying, that even uh reason and logic can only get you so far, and I do think that's a fact. Uh, but let's dive into the trending topics, because they do play into some of the things we just discussed.
Breaking news!
One of the trending topics that is going on, the corporation known as Ally Robotics has developing or has developed a robot that completely eliminates programming altogether, and it costs 70% less to operate than competing robots. So apparently it's a robot that can kind of think for itself and know how to do what its task is without a programmer kind of setting it all up. Um, have you heard about this? What's your thoughts about it?
So I've seen several different uh, attempt at programming illumination in robots. I've myself programmed robotic arms all the way back in the 90s in college, and even at that time, there was already a move towards program minimization. But that sounds very much like sales marketing speak to me. Um, that that's how every kind of robotic innovation I've ever seen was sold, and none of them truly eliminated the programming step. What they did was uh, created greater and greater facilities for guided learning of what's going on. So, for example, the arms that I was programming back in college. Uh, Effectively had a little joystick system that you would run through the task that you wanted. And there was a camera, a joystick, and control arms. And so you'd use the joystick and the camera and tell the system when it had gotten into a position or was looking at something you wanted to be looking at, that that was one of its key points. And the way that you programmed it was running through the task with key points in place, and then setting it in motion to just do that over and over again, or to make the decisions based on that. And so what I've seen over the last couple decades is people doing better and better jobs with that. And I could definitely see a scenario where, with machine learning, with modern image recognition getting as good as it's getting, that they could make that kind of system significantly smoother. But eliminating programming in a computer context isn't a isn't a meaningful thing to desire to do, because the hard part of getting a system to do what you want isn't the programming. It's understanding enough yourself about what you want, for there to be a system that has the properties that you're looking for. And mostly people can't do that without some kind of iterative, experiential, try and try again type of scenario, which is why so much of programming involves uh, long-term iterative debugging, lots of beta testing, uh, release to the customer, and then seeing what happens and so on. Because uh, we we don't understand ourselves what we're interested in well enough to get it.
I do think that's very fair. From what it sounds like, from the article that I read, that it definitely sounds a little bit salesy. I mean, one of the kind of links and highlights of the article is that, oh, you can start investing in us right now. When we go off, you're gonna be making a lot of money. So I was like, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I see what they're trying to do there. Another aspect of it is that they indicated that it's kind of learn everything itself. So it's playing onto that AI aspect of like this robot. You're not gonna need. Well, they said 70% less operation, so you're not gonna need to teach it. It's gonna teach itself. So I don't know how successful it will be when it eventually comes out, but that is something they're trying to do. Do you, if they were successful, let's put it on a hypothetical, if they were successful and able to create a robot that in all intents and purposes does not need anybody to kind of program or work with it, can kind of do the job by itself, do you think that is a danger to workers um in the future?
So, reinforcement learning AI is a pretty decently understood technology at this point, and has absolutely mastered chess, Go, shogi, poker, a number of other games that have very large spaces of operation. So I could see a contextualized, like, robot arm worker thing using some sort of reinforcement learning in out system to teach itself to, say, weld a door the most efficient way that it can figure out how to do. Um, I can't see the training process being terribly cost effective, but maybe they have some kind of way that they've figured out how to figure that out. Um, and and that would be a micro optimization that still might not help your factory out because you've figured out how to weld doors to that kind of car, and then you start manufacturing trucks and you have to go back to zero and train it all over again, which, to be fair, you'd have to train people to make different kinds of stuff as well. In terms of threat to jobs, I'd say we should very much be thinking in those terms. Uh, when when I say that the foundations have crumbled, uh, I'm not kidding, and we shouldn't expect uh, things that have been successful to keep being successful if we decide to hang on to computer technology. I'd be, in general, less concerned about technical manual jobs, um, because they're much, much harder to deal with the technology that we have. It would be much easier, although I don't know that we yet have the capacity for this either. But it would be much easier from a technological point of view to replace people in the C-suite than people on the factory line with computers. Uh,
Mhm.
but uh, we know that the people in the C-suite aren't making good decisions. That's
Right.
actually one of the articles of faith of capitalism, is that sort of markets can make good economic decisions. People can't make decisions as well as markets can. Um, we also know that we have information systems of vastly greater breadth than we've ever seen before. And as you're talking about social media, uh, these these organizations are in control of systems that are mixing the business world with the cultural world with mathematics in ways that we have zero historical experience. And certainly none of the people working in these institutions have any reasonable claim for figuring out the trade-offs, what positives and negatives are involved in the mere existence of their businesses.
Mm.
So I'd imagine that most of the things that are successful have some flaw horrifying enough that that its correction is more important than the continuation of the successful thing. Um, but I couldn't even begin to guess what those flaws would be. Just as like I think I think we're at a moment now on par with the creation of city type societies, or the transition to the industrial era, where the ways that people lived in, say, a nomadic hunter gatherer scenario were just incompatible with a sedentary agrarian society,
Right.
or a sedentary agrarian society being incompatible with a urbanized industrial society. I'd expect that we now have a very advanced urbanized industrial society. I'd imagine how we live is incompatible with having an information communication society. And
Mm. I think
And
that's
so,
very interesting. I do think that's a very strong point, and I think the cracks are showing now. I personally believe our current society, in terms of, obviously, you know, a lot of us are living. If you compare it to like most of the world, a lot of us are living very easygoing lives for the most part. But you can see the cracks in terms of the the turmoil between people, the way people are getting more and more mental illness. Like, I do think there's something there, and we're gonna touch upon that a little bit more. But speaking about social media, there's actually another bit of trending news, which I was referring to earlier. So apparently, Texas is passing a censorship law, and what it's the law entails is they're going to prohibit large social media companies from banning users' posts based on their political viewpoints. And that will go into effect after a federal appeals court on Friday lifted a block placed on the statute. And this is part of a movement by Texas to make sure that conservative voices are not silenced. There's a belief that, for the most part, a lot of these big social media corporations tend to lean more liberal and democratic, and that Republican and conservative voices are being shunned out. They use the example of Donald Trump getting banned, and many other examples of like different conservative voices getting unfair treatment in comparison. I know one counterpoint to this is, if you allow it to where anybody can say any political dialogue, then you could potentially allow for the extremists, very hateful speech going in there as well. For example, like the terrorist organizations, the potential dangerous speech that I won't elicit here today in the podcast. But that's the counter argument for some people, that you're allowing these people's voices if you allow this law to go through. So this is something that Texas is trying to put in place in regards to social media. Because of recent years, I would say the last few years, and how social media and political ideology and strife have become one and the same, which is something you were referring to earlier, in the sense that the social media has become so large that it encompasses so much things, and its influence is like just not wide encompassing, is how I'm going to put that. Wide encompassing. I was about to say dangerous, wide encompassing, because we can't get rid of social media. So with social media and the political situation, with some people may argue that it does lean left, now we got whole states wanting to attack social media, say, yo, do it this way. It's just telling you how impactful social media is currently. So what do you think about this law that Texas is just trying to pass in regards to uh, letting all voices be heard potentially?
so this story I did see. I saw a note on the appeals court um, lifting the stay and allowing the thing to go forward. Uh, Existing social media companies, I'd say that the closest analog in human experience with what social media companies are is religions. Um, and in that context, existing social media companies are really bad religions. uh, they don't have a formative story. They don't have any kind of coherent ideology. Um, yes, it's true. There is a lot of perception that they lean left. I'd say that it's probably a lot closer to the truth to say that they lean institutional. Um, it's no secret that Washington D.C. votes overwhelmingly Democratic in every election cycle, uh, and that's not because people that work for the federal government don't vote. It's because the people that work for the federal government are overwhelmingly Democratic, and and the social media companies, many of them have important government contracts. They work closely with government officials. Um, there was government funding for a number of them. So I again I describe them as less less leftist and more institutional, but our institutions might be considered to be left of center. Uh, but in terms of like their social power and their social consequences, uh, the power is clearly quite strong. Um, but the consequences, they don't look good. Associative things with like mental illness, uh, we see correlations in kids between their like online time and suicide rates. That's horrifying. Uh, these things might not pan out. It might be a coincidence. Maybe, other things are breaking at the same time as Facebook is succeeding, but zero of them have put forth a case for what they're offering and why they're offering it and what good that they're bringing into the world. And structurally, they act like religious institutions. And say what you will about any of the sort of major world religions, from the Abrahamic religions of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or non-Abrahamic Buddhism, Hinduism, Shintoism. They all actually have a stated point of view and declaration of where they come from, even if it's supernatural, and declaration of what the value that they offer to the world is. Um, and something like Twitter can't even do that. Uh,
Right.
so, so to me, this conflict, I think, is indicative of the kinds of cracks that you're seeing. This I think is a very apparent crack that we're seeing in our society and culture, because we're sort of putting free speech on one side versus social comedy on the other side, in a way that's charged to a level that would be literally unimaginable at any other time in human history. Uh, but at a deeper level, what we're seeing here is religious forces, quite literally, coming out. And the fact that these religions are explicitly godless um, does not ensure that they're good, nor does it ensure that they're bad. Um, but the it's it creates conditions that really eliminate the normal social pattern of finding a consensus that we can all live with.
Yeah. There's two things I want to add to that before we move on to the next segment. The first thing is it's very interesting when you think about how the internet is today. And like you said, the enormous amount of time that people, kids, young adults spend on the internet, on their technology, and how it's completely deteriorating their mental health and this dissociative identity time and time again. Especially when you consider, like, for me, I grew up in a very interesting period. I grew up in a period where technology wasn't that prevalent because I grew up late 1990s. So technology was not that prevalent. So I grew up where it's kind of like we're growing up with technology and then bleed into the social media area. So I kind of grew up in like two separate eras, so to speak. And when the internet was very different back then, is I would say the internet was much more brutal back then in what kids can access. Nowadays, it's very, even though it can be very damaging, you don't nearly see as bad as the things that I saw very easily. Like, if you know what Two Girls, One Cup is, very disgusting. You shouldn't be seeing that. But I saw that as a kid. If you know what Three Guys, One Hammer is, if someone knows what that, very disturbing. I'm not going to explain what happened, but it's a very brutal thing that a kid should not be seeing. But very evil acts, very terrible things that can really scar a person. But it seems like even with stuff that was so available and so destructive for kids back then in the internet age, as it was first beginning, I don't see that nearly as damaging as the internet today, which is much more filtered and more manipulative, but doesn't show nearly as much of horrific things that the internet did back then.
I'd say that's true, and I think the reason is because of the filters. The issue is that it's now relatable. I'm older than you. I saw the first run of Star Wars in theaters. I was a little young at the time, but that's how old I am. And the sort of first splash of the internet, I was in college at the time. Definitely, there was some very bizarre stuff out there that you could look at, but it was so bizarre that it would not be seen as any part of your life. But with now the filtered thing and the rise of internet fame and a sort of new kind of relationship being mediated through these systems, we now get this picture of life where it's not life, and so there's houses where 15 social media influencers live, and they have studio rooms set up so that it can look like they're living a much more glamorous life than they're actually living, and they talk 40 million teenagers into thinking that their lives are pointless because they're not crashing a car into a mountain or something. Um, and and it looks like you really could do that. And the thing is, not even they are doing it. Like not only can you not do that, they can't do it either. It's just fake. But it's presented in a way that's real enough that it gets inside people, and it becomes aspirational. One of the crazier ones I saw. Are you familiar with the concept of body dysmorphia?
Uh, I think so, but explain it.
So if your physicality alters quickly enough, your self-image won't keep up with reality, and this can lead to eating disorders. That like anorexia. People look in the mirror and see themselves as fat, even though they've gotten thin. If they get thin too quickly, it can happen to amputees or
All right.
people who get injured in war or whatnot. It can happen to bodybuilders, where if you sort of get pumped up too quickly, you can't see that, and so you look at yourself and you're small, and then you sort of drive yourself to unhealthy lengths to keep overdeveloping and so on.
Right.
Um, Several years ago, it was discovered that there was an entire spate of body dysmorphia being caused by Instagram filters because girls could look at themselves on their phone, change what their appearances looked like, and and think that they looked like that because they were looking at it, but have their brain not be able to catch up because, of course, they don't look like that
All
because
right.
nothing
Yeah.
ever happened in the first place. And so suddenly this thing that can literally happen to anybody. Like body dysmorphia isn't something that exclusively happens to 14-year-old girls. It mostly happens to them because their bodies are changing sort of the fastest that any human body's ever changed.
All
But
right.
you can do it to, like, a 70-year-old retired guy if you change his body faster than his brain can keep up with. But we have apps on our phones that literally do this to people, and we unleash them on our entire adolescent population, um, with not a care in the world.
Mm. It's a very interesting perspective, and I never really thought about it in that sense. Obviously, there's a realization because of people like the Kardashians that they're ruining the image of beauty for young girls, of course. But the aspect of body dysmorphia because of filters and stuff is nothing I ever really considered. So it's a very interesting point. We're gonna move on to the next segment. This is called Contra segment. It's kind of a this or that, so it's choosing between two different topics.
It's about to go down.
Now, a few questions. So I'm curious to see what you say about these. So, first question is, do you believe people should be focused on the future more or history more?
Well, the future. You're going to live there.
So, in terms of, right, people have argued a lot in terms of the value of history. So when it comes to like a school setting, for example, should what do you think is more valuable for teaching kids and telling them, "Yo, this is what you should be learning about"? Do you still at the future, or would you change it to history?
I'd stick with the future even there. Again, because that's where they're going to be living. Uh, History has its value in learning about what has been tried. Um, but one of the basic challenges that really gets passed by is that learning lessons from history is very difficult because creating coherent and accurate uh, assessments of why things happened is not merely difficult, but almost a contradiction in terms. An accurate statement is going to be incoherent, and a coherent statement is going to be inaccurate. Because, well, to take an example, it's common knowledge that World War One was caused by Archduke Ferdinand being assassinated. Um, Except, of course, there were hundreds of millions of people who were alive at the time, and all of them had day-to-day lives just like everybody's always had. And all of them doing everything that they did caused World War One. So while that single event was obviously very important, lots and lots of other things were going on. Um, at the geopolitical level, at personal levels, just for the assassin to get there in the first place, for people to be that concerned about stuff, for Ferdinand to be in the line of succession, to have the relationships he had, for the car to be where it was. There's so much happening that it isn't reasonable to actually have a coherent picture of what's going on. And while it may well be the case, I think it's probably likely that the primary cause of World War One was sort of that spark. The giant pile of tinder that Europe had turned into was the result of trillions of decisions made in day-to-day lives by people important and unimportant for generations prior to that. And controlling for all of that and learning all of that of sort of how to form your life to avoid big catastrophes, small catastrophes, everything else is it's it's mostly noise. Um, and again, you're never going to live there. You're going to spend your entire life living in the future.
That's a very good point. not only the aspect of, obviously people have heard it time and time again, the essence of the butterfly effect, where any minor change can change the course of history. A lot of aspects of history, a lot of nuance and context that people don't consider when they look at these scenarios. But also the aspect of like history itself. A lot of people have said it time and time again. It is framed from the lens of the victor. So it's not, it's very possible that the history you're learning is not even the true history of what actually happened back then. History has its value, but I also agree that the future, the current problems and proceeding into the future is definitely stuff we should focus on currently. Next question. In a perfect world, would you rather have a socialist economy or a capitalist economy?
I don't like either of those words, and I don't presently believe that the popular conception of either of those things has a future.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. All right, next one. Do you believe it's more efficient to learn how to be an entrepreneur at a very young age, young adult to teenager, or like an older adult with some experience?
I think it's probably more efficient to do it younger. Um, it's, I'd say, fairly unfortunate that I came to this as old as I was. Um, I think it's even more unfortunate that our society has so organized itself that we view entrepreneurship as effectively the only path forward uh, for innovation. Um, One of the popular tropes among entrepreneurs is, sort of execute, execute, execute. Ideas are worthless. And I think that's a very important message for them because for the vast majority of them, their ideas are worthless. But valuable ideas exist, have existed, and it's where most of the wealth and good stuff of humanity has come from. Um, and and marrying these capacities together i- is a better path. Figuring out how people can specialize and those specialists can join their work together to build a stronger society is a much more practical reality and a much sort of better world than one in which sort of some Promethean god has to invent a completely new way of doing things and then force everybody else to start doing things that way all by themselves. Um, so so if you've got that drive and if you're going to be an entrepreneur, yeah, I think whether you're old and experienced or young and dumb, you're going to screw it up anyway. So you might as well have the energy for it.
Very fair, very fair. All right, these last three questions are something I ask everybody to really get their perspective. First one is, if you're scrolling through the internet, what do you think will, what image do you think provides more of a response? An image of a celebrity taking a picture with a fan or a cop saving a life?
Uh, I would respond more to a cop saving a life.
Okay, respect. I ask that to everybody because I do think I've said it time and time again that there's a what's the best way to put it? There's a certain dissociation with, or there's a certain lack of appreciation for like cops nowadays, certain hatred. I would say I would even go that far in terms of general opinions about cops. And I do think there is a glorification for celebrities to an extreme level a lot, and we've talked about it. That's probably mainly due to like social media currently. So very interested. um when it comes to you, and if you don't want to answer, by all means, you don't have to. Well, do you fall more on the left, right, or middle in terms of the political spectrum?
Uh, I'm like the purple on the like I said,
So the
I
middle.
think well no, like a totally different dimension. Like I said,
Okay.
I think I think the foundations of our system don't even exist and never have.
Okay.
So I see the necessity of building completely new things. Um, but I want those things to actually work. So one of my things, the reactionary and the revolutionary, each of these things, from my point of view, is based on a a sort of core half truth that they cannot get out. So it's a conversation. The revolutionary says everything is crap, which is true. And then he says, I can fix it. And the reactionary responds and he says, no, you can't, which is true because things are fine. And that's just no good. Like, we know that we're bad at basically everything. So we can do better. Um, but you can't actually do better if there's nothing. So you have to find a piece that you can actually fix. You have to sort of hope and accept that the stuff you're not working on is going to work out, and that's an enormous act of faith. And you have to find the most important thing you can fix and fix that. Um, and and that's it. And that's just going to keep happening. You asked about the perfect world. There isn't one of those. We we again, computer science tells us that there's an incompleteness at the heart of logic itself, and
Right.
so we can keep making improvements. We can keep learning more. We can keep striving forever, and not just us, any reasoning occupant of any universe interesting enough for arithmetic to function can do that, because there's an infinity that's so far away that every time you reach towards it, it gets further away. uh, and
Okay.
so that's it. Like, we're not going to have the society that we have because it's collapsing under the pressures that exist because we have social media, because we have computers, because we have global communication. And so we need to build societies that can exist, because the alternative is, a dark age.
Very fair. I do think there's large inefficiencies in the two party system, um, as of right now as well. Like you kind of summed it up so perfectly in terms of the aspect of revolutionary versus the reactionary aspect. So yeah, I'm all for that. In terms of that's how our party system is now, and it's the same old arguments, the same old sayings, and it's very not only obviously biased to a certain side, but stubborn as well, and doesn't really resolve anything in terms of conversation, which is like a big thing I'm a part of, which is something I said earlier. Last question before we move on to the main segment is uh, would you rather condemn someone you hate or forgive someone you hate?
It depends upon their condition. Um, I think if pity and forgiveness is an option, then it should be taken. But you cannot do that to someone who is a powerful threat. Um, the I just recently rewatched the extended edition of The Lord of the Rings, and one of the sort of key things in there is the hobbits not killing Gollum. Eventually, is the key moment that sort of tips the balance in favor of good over evil. Um, but Gollum is a pathetic creature. We do not see the same treatment of orcs, who are just as just as dangerous, just as evil in intent, but orcs are powerful. And so when the party is attacked by orcs, they have to be killed because they can't be forgiven because they're just too dangerous. Um, so that that tension exists for people that are still in positions of power and authority, or simply, you know, physically violent and dangerous. Um, and I think while they're in those positions, they have to be condemned.
Mm. I do think you make a great point, and there's a certain realization that people should have in the sense that even if you want to be a good person, does not necessarily mean that you can be ignorant. And I do think that yes, a threat should get your full focus and you should do what is appropriate. I'm a very efficient person that A, you should not beat around the bush against people who are one, a threat, and two, dangerous in terms of keeping you away from your goal or your being a threat to your family, all that stuff. So I do agree to that aspect. At a certain level, however, I think you kind of alluded to this. Once they're not a threat, once the battle is over, holding on to that adamant hatred is meaningless, in my opinion, because it doesn't really lead anywhere. Um, and then
I would
also,
agree. Yes.
yeah, and also, even in the situation that is less serious, for example, a situation where you're having a political debate with someone else and you adamantly hate this person, I do think that, like you said, they have to pose a threat. It has to be situational. You have to realize the priorities of what you're going through and the people that deserve an adamant level of negative energy. And on most times, it's not worth it. But hey, man, if you're on the battlefield, then you got to do what you got to do. 100% agree. So we'll move on to the main segment. And the first question I have in the main segment is, what did you mean by you're working on upgrading capitalism for the computer age? I think you alluded to it a lot throughout today's episode. So this time I want you to explain how you're going to create this revamped society,
Yeah,
or your
sure.
opinion on it, obviously.
Yeah. So capital markets are the heartbeat of our economy, and they're based on this idea called price discovery. The idea is that by knowing what the price level is, people that make stuff and the people that need to use that stuff can coordinate their businesses with one another without having to actually coordinate their businesses with one another on a one-to-one basis. So the amount of lumber that gets grown and cut and shipped is equal to the amount of lumber that people buy and then build houses with. The amount of wool that gets made is equal to the amount of wool that gets used. Wheat, copper, everything. Um, and so the way that these prices are worked out is a marketplace of buyers and sellers comes together, and every time a deal gets made, that deal gets published. So everybody gets to see a record of all the deals that are actually made. And as a result, you can sort of adjust your own interests in what kind of deals you're willing to offer, and the entire system can converge towards deals happening at around the same level. And this is conceptually a very simple system, uh, but it doesn't envision a world where computers can generate millions of deal offers every second. And so what's happened is that there's vastly more noise in our markets than has ever existed at any point in human history. And my observation is that a deal isn't the coming together of a person with a product and a person with money. It is the, in fact, threefold bringing together of the product, the money, and the information about the level the deal should occur at. And so I've developed a system which has three separate but convergent marketplaces, one for the information, one for the product, one for the money, uh, where all three sides have a market specifically designed for making that that transaction as transparent and effective as possible, um, where all three sides are attempting to converge with one another. And by doing it that way, you radically reduce the amount of noise in the system, which radically reduces the amount of effort and money that the system needs to chew up in order to operate.
Okay. So at the end of the day, with something like that, what would be the end goal in terms of its overall solution? Does it pump more money in terms of the economy? Does it help business owners and all businesses at every level? Uh,
So in
Go ahead.
economics, we have something called a deadweight loss. That's a cost that's borne by the economy that, if it wasn't being borne, could effectively go to the profit line. It could go to the bottom line. So transaction costs are an example of a deadweight loss. In the U.S. economy, according to U.S. government statistics, and this is quite some time ago because they don't publish updates of this very often, um, that cost in the commodity marketplace was around $800 billion. Uh, the American economies over the last decade, or actually over the last generation and a half at this point, has been growing at around a 2% annualized growth rate. Um, the size of our economy is now in the low 20 trillions. So the sort of prospective growth rate of the entire economy would be about $500 billion. So the transaction costs in the commodity space in the United States are larger than the average historical growth rate of our economy. If if this were significantly dropped, that cost would go onto the growth rate, and the economy would start growing, say, twice as fast as it used to, or even more crazily, 2 full points better than it used to. So a bumper year where we get 3 or 4% growth would turn into a fantastic year where we get 5 or 6% growth. A horrifying recession year where we get -1% growth would turn into an anemic, slow year where we had 1% growth. Um, we would effectively transform from an economy that was operating behind the Iron Curtain to an economy that was operating in front of the Iron Curtain, except instead of operating against sort of the communist totalitarian baseline, our current sort of capitalist baseline would be the bad place, and we'd get to live in this much, much better place. Uh, and it would show up at every level of the economy in businesses all over the place as farmers and miners and other commodity producers had radically higher rates of return, allowing those those businesses to be put on much firmer financial footing and new people to go into those businesses, leading to many more goods of much higher quality being produced. making it much easier to launch new kinds of product systems, because suddenly cloth and wood and steel and food and energy are all cheaper. Uh, so yeah, I mean, we're talking about a very broad-based, very material improvement in the rate of improvement of human econ- economics.
All right. So it definitely sounds very optimistic, obviously, considering in layman's terms it sounds like it would increase the efficiency of how the capitalist markets are going about the process anyway, overall causing the economy to increase or the growth rate to increase and obviously boosting the economy overall. My question for you is there's two ways in terms of the perspectives that I always consider when it comes to like potentially societal changes, because at the end of the day I do think there are levels of not corruption but um opposing forces because they care about what they got going on more so than what everybody else got going on. So, is there any potential deterrent that, in the terms of the perspective of the government, would have, and the perspective of the ultimate negative 1% that controls everything will have? Is there deterrent? Do you think there would be deterrent for your proposal that they would have for this situation?
It's definitely a possibility, and I lost count years ago of the number of people who claimed that I would be assassinated at some point. That hasn't happened yet. I've been doing this for the better part of a decade. Um, the really hard part, from my perspective, is just the getting started. There are a few people around the world that are starting to build out some of these markets that would incorporate this technology. Um, but humans don't like to think with their own brains, and that sort of goes double for smart people. As I was talking about before, it's a very common trope that there aren't any good ideas. So if you happen to believe that you have one, like I do, that's a big sort of concrete wall to slam into, because there's not a lot of interest in ideas in our economic system these days, or almost anywhere, uh, and that's really always been true. And it's a fairly reasonable stance to just decide that all ideas are stupid, because almost all of them are. But the good ideas, and leaving aside whether or not mine is one of them, uh, are responsible for so much of the wealth and capacity of humanity that you have to have the door open somehow to them, because otherwise we'd just all be living in caves without even spears to use. Like, we are the technological species. We need those ideas.
Very
Um,
true. Very true.
in terms of what governments may or may not be able to do, there's an economic concept called Gresham's law, uh, and it says that bad money drives out good money. And what it's about is how large consensus activity, economic activity, occurs in a society. And effectively, what happens is, if people have a choice between doing the same thing two different ways, and one of those ways offers them either more security or more money or both, then that way becomes the dominant way that things happen in that society. And if the people in charge don't like it, then it'll happen anyway. And if they insist, then they won't be the people that are in charge. Um,
Mm.
because it's a truism in American politics that people vote their pocketbook. well, this is a truism in world politics. And again, like we were saying before, you can't so much learn from history, but the markets that we use right now were developed in northern Italy at a time when they were effectively just uh, you know small out of the way ports that had some pirates in them. And at that point in time, uh, the Eastern Roman Empire, headquartered in Constantinople, was running Mediterranean the Mediterranean economy, which was the wealthiest economy in that hemisphere. And the development of these marketplaces caused the center of gravity of the Mediterranean economy to move from the Bosporus, the choke point of the Black Sea versus the Mediterranean, to northern Italy, a place that's on the way to literally nowhere, because you'd have to cross the Alps to go to anywhere once you got there. Uh, and they became some of the wealthiest people in European history. Um, and it's just because traders had a choice. You're on your boat, you could sail to Venice or Naples, or you could sail to, Alexandria or Constantinople, and they had better marketplaces in Naples and Venice and Genoa, and so they went there and they made more money. And it didn't matter that the Byzantines had a bigger army or a much longer cultural history or vastly greater religious influence. The, you made more money doing the other thing. So if this can get over that hump of getting started, the fact that this makes people more money should just mean that it sweeps the world. Because you know how would you feel if you can make more money or less money, left or right? Which one are you going to take? If left's more money and right's less money, left. If right's more money and left's less money, right it is. Um, and it doesn't take much of a preference like that to become truly dominant.
Mm. I do believe that. I mean, you made a good point, especially I guess one of the values of the internet is that its ability to spread ideas is uncontrollable. Like there's no power that can control the spread of the ideas at the end of the day. If you put it on the internet and it starts gaining traction, going viral, then there's really nothing you could do about that. So I do agree for that aspect. And if this were to work, obviously it would be very beneficial for the government capitalist markets. Now, there's another thought. There's been some other uh, rumblings, maybe last year more so than any, considering the changes in terms of like the Supreme Court and a lot of their recent court cases, like Roe v. Wade and other cases, of our current government and our current constitution. So going based on like the fact that you kind of refer to, or the basis of our capitalist markets refers to an older society, you could make the same argument for our current American democracy. So do you think at some point there should be, and I guess we did really talk about it prior, but at some point there should be a revamp in how our countries ran in terms of government, the government in general, and the Constitution, all that.
Absolutely. Um, the the fact that um, we're seeing breakdowns in law and order, which were the explicit desire of the founders to actually establish a system that would allow them to have law and order after getting rid of the king, um, uh, points to the the delegitimization by their own hands of their own institutions. And I would not expect as impressive a work it was to construct a political order that lasted for a quarter of a millennia. Uh, the intrinsic challenges from just computational mathematics again of what these sorts of things mean. Here's a fairly simple example. Um, Rule of law is a common trope. Everyone sort of understands that that's important. One of the most important things in computational mathematics is that sort of recursion changes everything. Once something becomes self-reflective, starts working back into itself, the entire basis of your logic needs to sort of level up to cope with that. So, in a system of rule of law in which we explicitly provide attorneys to keep the government honest to people that are accused of crimes, for example, uh, how can that hold up if the government itself is being operated by or for attorneys? So, can it be okay for members of the bar to be members of the legislature? Probably not. But lawyers have been a plurality of the legislative bodies for certainly my entire lifetime, and my understanding is really most of American history. Um, and with things like Marbury versus Madison, where the judicial branch, which is explicitly the branch of attorneys, has arrogated to itself the power to interpret the validity of the laws that come in, we again have a problem of whether or not the courts would be acting in favor of the bar over society in general. And I think we've certainly seen that the courts have been systematically favoring lawyers over non-lawyers for all of American history, really, um, which creates a severe problem in terms of having equality before the law if lawyers and courts actually have special status in those regards. Um, and that's just simple and obvious. A thing like a government is so complicated, and a thing like recursion is so slippery. Uh, I don't have any particularly good ideas for how we could go about creating governmental legitimacy in the face of the amount of noise, the amount of contact, and so on that we actually have to face now. But again, I think that's a real challenge.
I definitely agree. And I've thought about it extensively as well. And it's really hard, this is where the value of history comes in to really find an example like the United States of America, considering how different it is compared to so many other countries out there. The people, the ideologies, the magnitude, the different states, and how each state is basically their own country if you really compare it to like most countries in the world. Like the United States is a very unique system, but at the same time, like you said, it lasted for so long, hundreds of years, and still relatively, whether you agree with it or not, is like on top of the world, like mostly because of our military, but still stands. So they're really trying to find something that can truly replace the US Constitution to create a better system will be tough. I guess the only way you can really go about it is going about it in increments and segments, so to speak. And I guess in one,
Possibly,
go
although
ahead.
I will say again, going back to history, the Roman Republic at around our age had a pretty severe class divide issue. that was eventually resolved through the introduction of tribunes. Um, so the Roman Senate was explicitly dominated by their patrician, which was a sort of their upper class. And as a result of that, the plebeians really started to lose out economically in their system. And so a couple of land reformers called the Gracchi brothers, one of whom wound up getting assassinated, uh, had a popular uprising come along, and they came up with tribunes. And tribunes had there were five of them, and they were personally inviolate. It was treason for anyone to physically touch a tribune, um, and they had the right of veto. So any one of them could end any edict by the Senate, and the Senate was sort of the final authority in Rome.
Right.
Um, so I've thought about the possibility of some sort of tribune edition, perhaps to replace what's been lost by direct election of senators. You could imagine some sort of system of uh, state governor appointed tribunes that had some sort of regulatory denial powers, that where the states could push back against federal agencies, as sort of an analog. But yeah, um, something like that might help things totter along. But again, I see this very deep problem with our understanding of understanding, and working through the philosophical implications of that, particularly for people, the leaders of our political system. Politics is frequently dismissed as a simple popularity contest, but it's that's unfair. It's sort of the most complicated popularity contest that it's possible to have,
Very
but it
true.
is still a popularity contest.
Also very true.
And the
Well, at
I
this point, it's like a who's I hate the least contest.
Right. Yes. Well, that's where it's become ultra sophisticated, where it's like they've managed to drain the popularity out of it completely. But the leaders of these groups, while having cunning certainly and intelligence, sure, uh, don't have the interest, and possibly even the capacity to struggle with these foundational philosophical issues that really are dooming them. Um,
I have a question for you, kind of like a hypothetical. So, I've teetered around this idea. Not saying it's a better version of the United States, but I was curious because, like I said prior, a lot of our states are bigger than a lot of countries. Like our states are like our country is huge. These states are huge and sophisticated. They have their own ideology and all their own culture. What do you think about the idea of the United States operating more as as a system where these states are completely not sovereign, but they are completely autonomous with national general laws to keep, you know, general fairness across the board across all states. What do you think about the idea of all these states? Because Texas tried it so many times to secede from the United States of America. They keep on saying they're going to do it, and they never do it. But what do you think about the idea of these states really focusing on their state, their situation, their state government, and just having our overarching entity to make sure everything's fair across the board?
I just think that's unrealistic, um, for geographical reasons. There might be some splits that could happen, but generally speaking, it isn't practical for countries not to follow along natural boundaries, because most borders in human history are inimical. So if you don't have a physical boundary, then sort of banditry kicks in and you start seeing conquest. Um, and I don't think our military technology is at a point where conquest is an impossibility at this point. So having at the very minimum the big hunk of land that is uh, all of North America between the parallels west of the Rockies, um, seems to be sort of the least that could be done. Um, the founders envisioned a system much like you're talking about, where states would be effectively sovereign with a handful of sort of fairness rules. Um, but the difficulty is that what it means to be fair
Very
is
true.
a very slippery question that we don't have an answer for. And that answer is more important than what else we have going forward. And we've turned the answering of that question into this political conflict, which is, again, to circle all the way back to the beginnings, why Texas doesn't want social media companies to be able to put thumbs on the scale, because Texas is well to the right, or certainly the existing Texas politicians are well to the right of the social media companies, um, and so they want to be able to continue this political conversation. Uh, I'm not really certain that it's even productive to have that political conversation. Like I said, I see most of those as sort of two idiots shouting at each other. Um, I think that having learned that questions of philosophy have actual physical natures, because general computation and and information and energy are actually really the same concept mathematically and physically. Um, it's an engineering problem. It's an engineering problem we don't know how to solve. We we might not even have the tools yet to solve it, but that looks to me like a productive direction to be thinking about, and it's certainly the best I can do, is trying to work out these problems as actual physical problems. Um, and then the next stage, and the sort of the more fundamentally important one, is the moral dimension. And I've said on other podcasts, that's above my pay grade. Like, I'm not a prophet. I'm certainly not a god. I can't declare what right and wrong are, and so that domain, um, uh, needs at least as much work as our political systems do, and and I hope that we're working on it.
Yeah, I very much agree. I've talked about morals plenty on this podcast, and yeah, it's a very complex topic, of course. So we're gonna move on to the next segment, leading into the closing remarks. This is PC or C, politically correct or canceled. Two questions, you can answer both or one, up to you. First question, which is the safe question: do you have a role model? Second question: is, do you believe that humanoid robots and or sentient AI have rights? So you can either answer both or answer one, completely up to you.
Humanoid AI or robots having rights gets to a very fundamental question about the moral foundations of rights in the first place. Uh, One of the standard concepts behind the existence of rights is that they're a right duty pair, that in order for a culture to even exist in the first place, for there to be a society, um, the members of that society need to have matching pairs of rights and duties. And in that context, for an artificial person, an artificial intelligence, or let us say a mechanical intelligence, to be a part of a society that does function, they would have to have those roles as well. And so within that context, they would certainly have rights. Um, and so that doesn't strike me as particularly uh, ridiculous at all. Their rights would be matched with their duties, and would have to be structured in some way that was coherently moral. And again, like I just said, I I can't even start guessing. Um, in terms of role models, I quite like uh, uh, history. I've read a fair bit of it. I quite like stories, sci-fi, fantasy, and so on. Um, I find that there's a lot to admire in highly accomplished people, but the idea of modeling my life on some specific person, I don't. I mean, I understand that people do that. I just that's one of the ways that I differ from people. Uh, so I I try to be myself, and I hope that what that is good, and sort of go from there.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And if you or anybody listening uh are wondering why I asked the question, I think it's something we need to think about, especially considering relatively recently there's a whole controversy with Google and the potential leak that they have created a 7-year old sentient AI. Now Google completely denies all of that, but something to think about if
Let me
it's
tell you,
here.
if I
Then,
had created a sentient AI 7 years ago, I would deny everything too.
well, I meant
That's
it's a
that would
7-year
be the
old.
move.
That's
Yes. Um, it's a big problem, and it's really only been addressed in fiction. Um, One of the pioneers of that work, Isaac Asimov. Have you read his robot novels,
no.
or any of the rest of those? They're pretty readable even today, although there's a couple of technology things. One of the interesting things is he wrote his a lot of those novels before computers existed, and so they have humanoid robots and slide rules because they don't have computers, but they do have humanoid robots. But he posited a concept of robots that would be more moral than humans. And that's, if you've ever heard of the three laws of robotics, he came up with that. And the idea was that at the first level, robots would not be allowed by action or inaction to cause harm to a person. And at the second level, a robot must obey any order given to it by a person unless it would contradict the first level. And at the third level, and this is where the rights thing would sort of come in, the robot would have to see to its own self preservation unless doing so would contradict the first or second level. So if a robot saw a child in the street while a car was coming down and realized that it could rush out and push the child out of the way, but it would be destroyed, it would without hesitation do that. And if a robot was ordered to destroy itself, it would without hesitation do that, because in each case it would be fulfilling a higher order uh, uh, imperative than its own self-preservation. But if it was simply carrying out normal duties and it could do it in a way that, say, cut off its own leg or didn't cut off its own leg, it would do it in a way that didn't cut off its own leg, because seeing to its own self-preservation would be an imperative that it had. And in Asimov's formulation, the existence of those robots destroys the societies that use them, because having servants that are more moral than you are effectively so degrades the moral foundations of the societies that they simply disintegrated. Um, and that's a fairly interesting perspective.
Hmm. That is a very interesting perspective. Uh, that's a very complex question. It also makes me think, if the technology was put about, would they make it in a way where it has completely reactionary functions, where it reacts based off a specific scenario, or will it be given complex thought? And if it is given complex thought, will it create emotions? And then we'll see how that kind of proceeds after that in terms of those three laws. But very interesting, a very interesting question, of course. So, final question of the day. Like I asked earlier, for you to think about a scenario where you were in a discussion, debate, conversation with someone you disagreed with vehemently. Um, did you have a situation like that? How did it go? And what was the topic about?
Um, I've had I've had a few of those. Uh, you were talking about sort of total disagreement with the person, though, and so that I can really only think of a couple of instances of that. I was at uh, the Agricultural Commodity Futures Trading Convention. Um, this was a few years ago. It was the year before COVID hit, so 2019, and uh, there was sort of a mixer in the bar after the first day's session, and I was talking to a guy who was a professional trader about my system and how it worked, um, and the advantages that it accrued. And this guy is a professional trader. He mostly trades in the existing marketplaces. He isn't one of the beneficiaries of my system. In fact, his job would effectively be eliminated. Uh, and his position was that the noise that I was identifying as a problem was in fact the marketplace. And so he made the point that since 97 to 98% of market activity is just traders trading with each other, that if the sort of edge users of the marketplace were to leave, the market would actually only lose 2 or 3% of its activity. And so it wouldn't matter. 2 or 3% off, that's fine. Everything keeps going. But what I could not get him to understand, no matter how I, fit it together to try to jam into his head, was that they're the entire point of the marketplace. The marketplace exists so that those users can figure out what prices are. And so he was saying that if the market's just fully detached from reality and we're just people pretending to trade things that they would never see or touch was the entirety of the activity, then society would just go on and be fine and sort of 2% off. Uh, and I I just had to give up in disgust, basically. The that obtuseness was so severe that I couldn't penetrate it. And I've gotten to that point with other people that were professional traders, and I was frequently able to not get them to see themselves as sort of, not to see their own incomes as a negative consequence of the marketplace, but at least to acknowledge that, broadly speaking, it was a cost in the marketplace for people like themselves to be drawing incomes from this sort of fantasy behavior. Um, but he didn't see the sort of real economy as having any more than 2% of the value of the financial economy, and that consequently the financial economy could dispense with reality at the cost of only 2% of itself. Um, and that was a very bad experience. Now, in complete fairness to him, it was the after party at the bar. He might have been so drunk that he wasn't capable of coherent thought, but still capable of coherent speech. Uh, but yeah, that was a deeply frustrating experience.
I could definitely imagine a situation where you have this idea and there's a certain stubbornness on the other side. Um, so you said you had this conversation with other people with similar fields before, and you said those went much smoother. Am I correct?
Yeah, yeah. I've usually been able to get them to understand that, in spite of sort of 49 out of every 50 things being pretend, it's that one thing, the real thing is the actual point of the entire system. Um, and and that's a little harder. Now, there's still been some blocks. My favorite one of all time, it was very early on. I had about a 3-hour conversation with a guy I'd gone to high school with, who had been an expert in corn, uh, where he drilled in and tried to find any chink in the idea he could find, and he failed. He admitted that he had no idea, like, how this thing was broken. But his final words were, um, "I'm sure it won't work, but I don't know why it won't work." So he had done his absolute best to try to find a way to break it. He couldn't do that, but he was so committed to his belief in the system that exists that he was unwilling to accept the possibility of an alternative. And I've encountered a lot of that, and I don't find that as frustrating, because, as I said again very much earlier, the capitalist system has very much become a item of religious faith, and a lot of people have that faith. And barring barring the introduction of somebody's God telling them that they're wrong, religious faith can be very difficult to sort of overcome. Uh, so that I don't mind so much, but a person unwilling to acknowledge the possibility of sort of fantasy being less important than reality, that really gets to me.
I understand that as well. I've had many of conversations, debates, discussions all about a lot of different topics. And you could go as far as saying that their ideology or the topic that they're focused upon is very similar to a religious faith, and you wouldn't be wrong about that. However, what I've come to learn is that there is a way, there is a way to really try to make them understand. And no matter how logical you are, you gotta, this is not dumb it down for them, but make them connect to the proposal being said. And that's why I say most people are. I think most people for the most part feel before they think. So the moment you introduce an idea that immediately triggers a specific feeling, then that's going to be in the forefront. So, have you ever thought about, like, in your future conversations, or maybe you've already done this, is focusing on making sure that feeling is not immediately distrust, non faith, anger, etc., etc.?
That's yeah, that's I've been describing this to people serially for the better part of a decade now, and I've been on this sort of podcast guesting thing for about a year now, and I think that's helped me out a lot as well. And so that's what I'm always doing. Um, in my head, it's still a sort of system of computation. There's a
Right.
set of integral equations that describe how the information comes in and gets processed and then goes back out again. And you can imagine a set of inputs and outputs that would be filtered through such a system and look at what would happen. And so I have to translate things back to there and back again. Um, but I'm working on coming up with these things that can connect and resonate with the broader audience, because it's it's our economy too. Like the thing is, outside of some people that live in nearly or fully uncontacted tribes in very remote corners of the world, all of us live, work, eat, drink, get electricity, clothing, housing from these marketplaces. Um, and and our level of wealth is very much based on how efficiently they do their jobs. Uh, and so that's that fact is why the people that operate the systems that we have equated themselves to, these sort of disciples of God, that they're doing the foundational work that holds up the world. um, because what they're doing is incredibly important. It's just the system itself that's broken. It's not so much that these people are evil. Some of them are, most of them aren't, or that they're criminals. Some of them are. I don't know whether or not it's most or only some. Nobody does at this point. Um, but they are important. It's the system that's broken, not the people that's broken. And
Right.
that's sort of much worse because it means that even if we had a supply of highly competent saints that were rumbling around not doing anything that we could shovel in and replace the people with, because the system is broken, that would get screwed up. That would be screwed up too. So we have to fix the system.
Right. I think for the most part, I mean, for me, I understand, but my last takeaway is that the system obviously sounds very optimistic, and it seems like it's be very efficient. My only comment about the message that you're delivering to the people that you're telling about the scenarios is trying to connect it to them and their interpersonal lives, because at the end of the day, like I said, people can be very selfish and only care about what they do. I mean, you see it all the time where people are uh don't really care about the politics of what is going on in their country. But once you start talking about what they're doing on their everyday lives and trying to apply to them and really like stick it to them, that's how politicians get their vote. So it's a not manipulation, but it's really human understanding, and it's just an extra effort. But in order for people to really understand, they have to feel what you're saying and how it applies to their lives specifically. And innately, when you talk about it in terms of the system itself and its purpose and how our system is broken, yes, it involves everybody here. But not everybody can think that far, want to think that far, or even care. So that's my only thing in regards to that. I think, like you said, you've been working on it, and I believe it. And for people like me, will understand it. I have a very negative perspective on the average person across on the streets. That's just me. They're not a bad person, but you're not the smartest cookie. I've said it time and time again. That's fine. It's okay. Not everybody has to be. But that is all we got here today. Any final words, final plugs, anything that you want to say before we wrap it up?
Well, sure. If people want to learn any more about what I'm working on, I've got a website at chorddisc.com. You can reach out to me. I'm at noahphealy@yahoo.com or LinkedIn, the one and only social media platform I'm on. I'm the Noah Healy on LinkedIn.
All right, yes, sir. His information will be in the description for these podcast episodes. And obviously, if you go to my website, www.thetrendwithrtlfaith.com, you will find his information and his profile connected to this episode. You could check everything out. So that is all we got. So take care. Thank you so much for listening to today's podcast episode. Just a reminder to never miss an episode. They publish Tuesday, Friday, and Sunday at 7 a.m. EST. So if you're driving to work or you're working out, tune into the podcast. Also consider visiting the website, www.thetrendwithrtlfaith.com, and leave a review so I can personally thank you for your support to the podcast. So again, thank you so much for listening. And remember that solutions can only really be made through proper conversation and discussion. Take care.